Okay, next we have the electronic visit verification, and this will be presented by Alec Graham, who is the Office Chief for Home and Community Programs and Aging Long-Term Support Administration.
So again, my name is Alec Graham, and I am the Office Chief for Home and Community Programs with the Aging and Long-Term Support Administration at DSHS. And I'm going to share some updates on electronic visit verification during my time today. But you hopefully got kind of a taste of what is to come on EVV during the information provided by Karen and Vanessa on the consumer-directed employer. But we'll go ahead and jump into it here. So, just a little bit of background for those of you that are new to the subject of electronic visit verification, and you'll hear me use the acronym EVV pretty regularly. But this comes from the 21st Century Cures Act, which was a federal statute that was passed quite a few years ago. I believe it was 2016 or 2017, roughly when it was passed initially. But it includes a requirement that for certain services, including personal care and home health services, that there be an electronic verification of certain pieces of data. And I've got those listed out here on the slide deck. So for personal care, that's the type of service that was performed, who received the service, who provided the service, the dates of the service, and the location where service began and where the service ended. And then again, the time at the beginning and ending of services. So, it applies pretty broadly across Medicaid waivers. So that's another component of this. When I talk about the EVV requirements, they are specific to Medicaid funded services. So other types of in-home personal care may not be subject to EVV requirements. But it does apply to many of the services provided by DSHS that are under the federal Medicaid authorities that are listed on this slide. But that might be a little bit more detail than anyone's interested in. But a really important component of EVV is the consequences of non-compliance. And I'm going to spend a little extra time on the why here as EVV, for those of you that have experienced it in practice, it can be challenging both for providers and clients. Certainly DSHS and our partners have done our best to limit those impacts, but the nature of it is different than how we have operated up until this point. But one of the tricky parts of the Cures Act is that it included a section that has a monetary penalty to states if they do not comply with the requirements. And that comes in the form of a percentage penalty to the federal medical assistance. So this is also known as the FMAP. And this is the amount of money that the state receives from the federal government to provide Medicaid services. And you can see here that it escalates each quarter that non-compliance is found to be an issue. And when you're talking about the scale of the state Medicaid program, those percentage points can add up very quickly to the tune of millions of dollars. So, going into implementation, that was weighing heavy on the minds of myself and many others within DSHS. But you can also see that the statute did offer a one-year good faith effort exemption to push the implementation date back from January 1st, 2020 to January 1st, 2021. And it has an impact on the percentage of FMAP reduction that would be associated with non-compliance. So going into January of 2021, the state would have encountered a 0.5 percentage point reduction in FMAP spending if we had not complied with the statute. The other thing to keep in mind is that with federal rules of this nature, there's also the consequence of not complying, where in an audit there could have been a major disallowance to federal funds in general. So it's similar right now. I think an example would be with electronic timekeeping requirements that are currently in place for home care agency providers. The state is regularly audited by the state auditor's office for compliance with those rules. And if the state does not comply, they will report up violations to the federal government, who can make major decisions about the amount of funding that the state is receiving. So, there was a lot of monetary consequences for noncompliance, both in the immediate application of the FMAP penalty, but also long-term financial consequences to the programs just for not complying in general. And these FMAP percentages, the way the federal government set up EVV, would have hit the budgets that pay for in-home Medicaid services. So this was really one of those situations where we had to move forward with implementation, or there would have been direct impacts on the types of services that could be paid for through the Medicaid program. So, that's some of the background about the financial components of this, and the way that looks in practice as far as the timeline. You can see on this slide that I pulled from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the federal agency tasked with implementing EVV at the national level. And you can see the original deadline moved from January 1, 2020 to January 1st, 2021, as Washington was one of 49 states that did get that good faith effort exemption. So this was kind of the perspective that the state had as we, closed out the year of 2020, and we're moving into the next steps with EVV implementation. And I believe it was about a little over a year ago, in February of 2020, I was actually speaking with this group. I had the opportunity to present on the subject of EVV with our tribal partners. We were in person, I believe, at this point, but this was the slide that I had presented at that time, where we talked about the plan for EVV implementation. And where we were at that point was that the state had selected a provider choice model, which would allow in-home personal care providers to select their own EVV vendors. So for individual providers, that meant the consumer-directed employer would have been responsible for implementing EVV, and they selected their vendor of choice. And the same thing applied to home care agencies, who also were going to select their own EVV vendors. And the original plan for IPs, so our individual providers, was to have the consumer-directed employer implemented in time for the penalty avoidance, and then have them roll out their EVV application as part of this general implementation of that program that Karen and Vanessa just covered. So this was February of 2020, and then things changed. I think all of us here don't need a reminder of what happened at the end of February and the beginning of March, but things changed dramatically for all of us, including the EVV project. So at that point, we had to pivot on some of our plans as as you heard, the consumer-directed employer had to change gears a little bit. All of us are very excited about the progress that Karen and her team and all the folks from CDWA have made, and I'm very confident about their implementation that's coming up. But it would have happened after the implementation requirement date. So if the state had continued with its previous plan, there would have been the financial consequences that that we discussed previously. So what the state did was create an interim plan for individual providers where we would implement EVV with our existing payroll vendor, which operates the IP1 payment system. So that's Public Partnerships Limited. And then to transfer the responsibility of EVV to the consumer-directed employer once it is implemented, and that is still our current plan. For home care agencies, so this is the other group of Medicaid providers that was subject to EVV requirements, we revised our original plan to break out the EVV requirements into 2 steps. So that way we could only implement the steps that were absolutely necessary to comply with the federal requirements and avoid the financial penalty associated with EVV. So that's how we got to EVV step 1 and then EVV step 2. We then moved forward with this revised plan. So, I mentioned, step 1 for home care agencies was really just to collect those mandatory requirements that were set by the federal government. So that way, we could be clear with CMS that we had met our obligations. But then step 2 is broken out separately, which this is the process of taking collected EVV data and submitting it into the state MMIS, so the Medicaid Management Information System. So you may know this as Provider One, which is acting as the state data aggregator for EVV. So the idea with this is the state needs to be able to see EVV utilization and compliance across the state. But when you select a provider choice model, each individual agency is going to have their own EVV data systems and records that may look very different. So step 2 is going to be the act of taking that data that was collected at each individual agency and consolidating it within Provider One so the state can utilize the data more effectively. Step 2, in negotiations with CMS, we realized is not necessary to comply with the Cures Act itself. So that's why it was broken out separately. So step 1 for home care agencies went into effect on November 1st of 2020, but there was a soft launch, meaning that in the months of November and December of 2020, there were a very soft approach to compliance with these requirements, with the idea that the state did not want to penalize any home care agency for non-compliance with EVV requirements until they'd had an opportunity to really test out their systems, as the federal requirements did not go into effect until January 1st. So that soft launch occurred during November and December, with home care agencies implementing their EVV systems at various times during that period, with full compliance required starting January 1st of 2021. And then I'm going to spend a lot of the remainder of our time talking about the IPs, but certainly if you have questions that I'm not able to get to during this presentation, particularly about home care agencies, my email address is on the first slide, so please feel free to follow up with me if I don't get a chance to answer your questions. But EVV for IPs was a significant task to take on, given that it was a change from the previous plans that had been in place for a number of years. So the state, representatives at DSHS, both at ALTSA and our colleagues at DDA, worked quickly to put together this implementation plan where EVV would go live for IPs starting on 12/16, so that way we could ensure compliance with federal law starting January 1st. So you can see kind of a rough timeline, and this changed a few times over the course of implementation, but there was a detailed communications plan that was developed where materials were disseminated to providers and across the state in preparation for the go live on December 16th, along with a rollout of training for individual providers that was put into place during the months of October and November. This was a voluntary training; it was not required. So there, was pretty good attendance, but certainly not all IPs participated in that training prior to the go live date. One of the significant components about EVV for individual providers was the collaboration with SEIU 775, which is the labor union representing in-home caregivers serving as IPs. And we were able to reach an agreement with the union to create a memorandum of understanding on the implementation of EVV. And this document covers kind of general background requirements, but also the detailed EVV requirements, an exemption for live-in providers, which we'll talk about here in a minute, EVV implementation in general, but it also covers some important components around data, privacy, and security, and then the transition to the consumer-directed employer. If you're interested in reading the MOU for yourself, it can be found at the link on the website. That's the entire collective bargaining agreement between the state and SEIU 775. So you're going to want to scroll down to the end of the document where the MOUs are housed and look for the one on electronic visit verification. But one of the important things about EVV is that we had talked a lot about with this group, along with other interested parties, was around the utilization of EVV data itself. And one of the things that was brought to our attention is concerns about how it might be used by law enforcement or immigration or those types of agencies. So the state was able to, come to the agreement that that's listed on the screen. This is pulled directly from that memorandum of understanding, and you can see that the state is intending to use this, for limited purposes. Certainly, if there's a request by law enforcement, we're going to follow existing DSHS policies, regarding those types of data requests. But also, the data is going to be shared primarily with the partners responsible for EVV. So the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the State Auditor's Office, the Healthcare Authority, those types of entities. The other major component of the MOU, and this was cataloged in Management Bulletin H20-102, was an exemption for live-in providers. And this was something that was offered by the federal government, where if you resided with the client, you could be exempt from EVV rules. So you can see here that the state put together pretty broad eligibility requirements for live-in exemptions, as the idea is we wanted to make sure that this was not a overly burdensome task to identify yourself as live-in exempt. So this is available on the IP1 portal currently, where IPs that meet these criteria would just self-select that option. For IPs that do not live with their client, they would be required to follow the EVV policies, which is to use the Time for Care application, which is offered by Public Partners Limited for EVV, or the interactive voice response system, which is a secondary submission method. And we're going to talk a little bit more about EVV submission methods here in a second. The other thing that was important in that management bulletin is the state rules on manual entries. So the idea with EVV is that by federal law, you are supposed to capture those data elements I talked about at the very beginning in real time electronically. So with the Time for Care application, the way it works is you hit the sign in button and the application immediately registers the time, location, who is providing the service, those types of things. But if that process does not work for some reason, the time still has to be captured. So that way the IP can get paid. So there are options to do manual entries. So these are non-EVV compliant processes to capture the necessary information for billing purposes. This can also happen if there's issues with connectivity, where maybe an IP lived in a rural area and just couldn't find a Wi-Fi connection or something like that. They may do a manual entry after the fact. The state wanted to take an approach with this where we would evaluate manual entry utilizations before setting hard rules on, so many of your time submissions have to be EVV compliant, where others are considered a manual entry. But you can see the rule here was pretty broad, that there is not a cap on manual entries at this time. The other thing that's important in that management bulletin was the documentation of an early initial implementation period, where the state agreed not to take contract actions against IPs for EVV non-compliance. This period is going to cover January 1st to June 30th, 2021. That does not mean that IPs are immediately going to start receiving contract actions on June 30th. The state is really interested in assisting IPs in understanding the process, the education that is needed to comply with EVV rules. But this initial implementation period will be coming to an end, and the state will start doing some compliance work, but this will be done in coordination with our partners at SEIU 775, but also in coordination with the broader community, and certainly our tribal partners, will be made aware of how this process will move forward. The last slide here I really wanted to cover was a little bit about EVV submission methods, and you'll see on this diagram here, we use the acronym LIE, but that stands for Live-in Exemption. So that's that group that we're talking about. But one of the things that we were very careful about is making sure there were multiple methods that IPs could submit their time in case they were having trouble with the EVV application. So you can see here, we talked about the Time for Care app, the interactive voice recording system, but we also created a system where IPs can continue to enter their time on the IP1 portal. It looks a little bit different because it's the time in, out requirements, but we also set up the call center that services IP1 to be able to take time over the phone and assist IPs in collecting time that way. And I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly. But I do want to acknowledge that this was a difficult program to implement. There were certainly many challenges that were faced. One of the biggest ones was the distribution to the communications materials, providing training, was complicated by what was taking place in November and December of 2020. So, the election taking place, a lot of the materials were being distributed via the U.S. Postal Services. So we ran into challenges about the mail having a very high volume due to all the ballots that were being distributed at the same time. There were heavy call volumes at the IP1 call center initially, but those have returned to normal levels. And then a delay in the release of adjustment functionality. So this was if you had a previously paid timesheet. There were a few issues with that functionality initially that have been worked on since, and for the most part have been resolved since the initial go live date. EVV outcomes, the state has been found compliant up to this point, so we have avoided that FMAP penalty. We have implemented step 1 for home care agencies, and will continue to work toward step 2 compliance. And certainly there'll be a lot of collaboration, with the community and with our tribal partners about next steps on EVV step 2. And we'll continue to work with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to ensure continued compliance in the necessary paperwork that has to be filed by the state. And then lastly, the transition to the consumer-directed employer. We are very excited to assist Karen and her team as we move IPs out of the IP1 system and the Time for Care application to the new CDE EVV platform. This you can see, this is the national statistics. There were 22 states that were not compliant on January 1st and got the penalty at that point. And then you can see the federal government's expectations as we move forward. Last slide, there's just a few links. If you have, if you're interested in further information, and you can send me questions directly. They are, my email address is at the front end of the presentation. So I'll stop there, and I think we are out of time on EVV. So thanks, everyone.